little bit for you now. We're going to take a little bit of a focus onto mutual banks and what it is exactly they do, what it is exactly that they are made up of, and how exactly people can get involved in them. Of course, the VBS scandal has brought a lot of light to the mutual banking saga and exactly how it works, and perhaps we should give you just an outlook on why it perhaps is different to your normal banks that you may use on a day-to-day basis. So this is pretty much what stands in the way of making a mutual bank what it is. It is regulated under a different act in itself. It's not just the normal banking act, but there's the Mutual Banks Act, number 124 of 1993. Yes, it has been amended ever so slightly, but it certainly is still the act that does remain. It is regulated under the Registrar of Banks at the South African Reserve Bank, and the Registrar of Banks is Kuben Naidu, who is the Deputy Reserve Bank Governor at the South African Reserve Bank. The banks, the mutual banks themselves, are owned by their depositors. So if you make a deposit into the bank, you essentially own a stake in the bank, and you can thus vote in shareholder or member meetings that the bank might have. So, of course, that makes you a form and part of that bank when it comes to flourishing, and you must register with the registrar. First, you have an application for authorization to establish a bank, and then within 12 months after receiving approval, if you get approval to establish a bank, you can then submit your application to register that bank with the registrar. You must also have a 10 million rand minimum capital in order to start that bank. Coming up onto more things as well, it is set out for a particular ideal. You do have to make sure that you set it up for the benefit of the depositors. Much like VBS, if you needed the advancement of a particular community, whether it be in the role of housing, whether it be in communities and in different facets as well, then you have set it up particularly for that reason and not other elements, whether it be savings, investments, the like. That is a different form of banking. The first mutual bank by history was organized by Reverend Henry Duncan back in 1810 in Scotland, and he did that so he could get his congregation, who were a bit of a working class congregation, to then develop thrift, and thus saying to themselves, we have money, let's perhaps use it in the most wisest way and not be wasteful about it. So Reverend Henry Duncan setting up that bank account for his congregation way back in 1810. Generally, it is a conservative bank. In order to survive the turbulent times, it doesn't have or shouldn't have the large debt piles that all the other banks have, and has been able to then continue to play themselves throughout the market. 3 mutual banks that are registered in South Africa at present, that is Finbond Mutual, GBS Mutual, and of course VBS Mutual, which is currently facing that situation and that scandal itself. Bank Zero is the latest mutual bank in terms of the act to have been granted the ability to establish a bank. It hasn't yet registered as one, thus it is not a registered bank under the Mutual Bank Act as yet. That is a look at how that's faring. So for more on not just this, but exactly how this all works, Desiree Naidu, a banking and finance lawyer at Norton Rose Fulbright, joins me. Thank you so much for joining us, Desiree. Really, really appreciate it. I suppose that makes sense.
Yes.
And that's clearly then a part of the business that perhaps wasn't followed to the letter by VBS.
So I think, the VBS issue isn't necessarily a regulatory one. Everything that you've talked us through from an application perspective and an authorization perspective was followed. If I was to give a view, I would think that the issue with VBS came perhaps in losing sight of the ultimate objective of a mutual bank, which is to operate in the benefit of your depositors, and to perhaps have lost focus on the savings element of the bank.
Yeah.
By nature, a mutual bank is a conservative investment entity, and you wouldn't in the normal course have the more risky investment types with a huge focus on preserving depositor funds.
And having lost that focus, is it because the general market itself no longer sort of looks good enough for mutual banks, or is it just the environment itself that's difficult to trade in? What might be the case that you lose focus of your primary aim and head in such a different direction?
Look, I think that's a difficult one to answer. The VBS saga is very much a case of, at least as it's unfolded, apparent mismanagement. I think we have to be careful to separate that from the legal position of the bank, because I can't see that there has been any shortcoming in that respect with VBS.
Yeah. From here, yes, they've said that it is perhaps cannot be saved. Would you agree with that sentiment?
Look, the curator and the investigator that has sent out the VBS report have had have information with regard to finances that we don't have. So for us to give a view as to whether that end analysis is a correct one or not is speaking out of turn.
Yeah. Let's talk about the regulatory environment for mutual banks then. Has there been sufficient sort of work done for the Act, you reckon, to keep it up to date, shall we say, with current times, so that things like this aren't happening?
Look, I think from a regulatory perspective, South Africa is fortunate, both with mutual banks and with your more commercial banks, in the sense that we've got very strong laws with quite a heavy-handed regulatory approach from our regulators. We have to accept, however, that even the tightest system of controls is to a large extent dependent on the information that is inputted into that system. So we can argue whether there's been regulatory failures, but that has to be balanced with the information with which our regulators were presented in order for them to take the steps that would, in retrospect, have been better taken earlier on.
So do you think the Reserve Bank also needs to look at itself and say, depending on the information we've been fed, as you said, whether we could have played a better role as the Reserve Bank in ensuring stuff like this doesn't happen? Look,
I think that's a global consideration for financial institutions. It isn't one specific to South Africa or the Reserve Bank. With the interconnectivity of our markets, there's no way that you can't address more attention to those elements. And it is steps that the Reserve Bank, again, not just the Reserve Bank, globally have been taken. I mean, we've seen it in South Africa with the Financial Sector Regulation Act, which gives greater powers in that respect with investigation and liquidation and protections. And more recently, the Financial Sector Amendment Laws Act, which creates protection for depositors in exactly a situation like this.
How can we ensure that we save our institutions now? I mean, that's probably a much harder one. But the laws in place are there, but they seem to be broken left, right, and center. And I mean, we could go from African Bank right through to now. It just seems to be happening a little more regularly. What can we do?
Oh, that's a tough one. Look, I think as a consumer, you are going to have to be a little bit more more diligent with your banks. Be aware of what your rights are. At least try and be informed with the type of products that you are placing your money in. The protections that your banks offer. That information should be forthcoming whenever you engage with a financial institution. On a broader level, our entities themselves have to ensure compliance. There's no two ways about that. And I think from a regulator level, there will be that increased level of oversight and due diligence, and it will come not through our current bouquet of laws, but new laws, as we've already seen coming through the pipes.
What scares you the most then? What do you fear the most out of this entire banking sector, whether it be regulations, whether it be the institutions themselves?
Look, I think the biggest concern for me, like I mentioned earlier, is the ability to rely on information. This issue hasn't, it isn't one that arose overnight, and it isn't just attributable to one person. There were various stakeholders, some of which had a duty to ensure that the correct information was given to the relevant sources. And I think if we get to a situation where we lose that ability to rely on those independent sources, that is for me the biggest concern.
Really appreciate your time now, Desiree. Desiree Reddy, there from Norton Rose Fulbright. As we just discussed, perhaps, that VBS scandal, how we can help fix it, just the laws in place as well, where the regulations are in place to perhaps help the sector a little bit further on.